So we are wrapping up a series today that we've been calling Holy Chaos, Creating Connections in Divisive Times. And over the last several weeks, we've been looking at ways in which we can, in the midst of these incredibly divisive, chaotic times that we find ourselves in, how we can come together and partner with God to heal the world. We've talked about what it means to see beyond our fears, the fears that oftentimes wreak havoc and hold us, paralyze us, keep us from living the life that God has entrusted us to live, the life that God dreams for us to live. We've talked about knowing when it is important to let go and when it is time to hold on. And last week we talked about the importance of embracing life with a spirit of creativity and curiosity, both in our relationships, that we can seek to understand, even more so than to be understood. This week we're going to talk about what it means for us to be reminded from time to time that we are all in this together, that we belong to one another, that our most desperate needs in life lie in this sense of belonging, this sense of connection with each other. The text that you're about to hear is from John's Gospel. It's late in the story, the night Jesus was in the upper room with his disciples. And Jesus knew that this was probably going to be the last time that he would ever be with them, and so he wanted to leave them with one last lesson on self-sacrifice, of utter love and service. And so this one that they had been following, the one that they adored, that they worshiped, that they trusted, that they loved, he did something extraordinary. He went to each one, he got down on his knees, and he washed their feet.
After he had washed their feet, put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you?" For I have set an example that you also should do as I have done to you. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
A while back, I attended a conference in which the keynote speaker was Alan Hilton. Alan is a minister in the United Church of Christ, and he's written a book called A House United, How the Church Can Help Save the World. In this book, he suggests that we are living right now in not the United States of America, but what he refers to as the divided states of America. That we are more divided as a nation at this time than at any other time since the Civil War. It was during the Civil War in 1858, June, when Abraham Lincoln gave a speech to the Republican Party in Illinois that would go on to become famous. And in that speech, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Now, of course, those words were not original to Abraham Lincoln. He was quoting Jesus, who offered that same prophetic warning over 1,800 years before. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Perhaps we need to hear that once again, because we as a nation are divided. And there are all sorts of statistics and figures that I can give you to describe and articulate that deepening divide, but you don't need that. You know it. You see it. You feel it. How we have become so divided and polarized. The bottom line is that when it comes right down to it, that families have split. Relationships, friendships have ended. Gone are the days of Lincoln's team of rivals, where people with differing opinions would come together, would work together for the good of the country. Or even the days when Republican President Ronald Reagan would reach across the aisle and work with Democratic Congressman Tip O'Neill. In this current divide, though, it seems that compromise is almost impossible. That the political aisle keeps getting wider and wider and wider. And sadly, as the honored chambers of the U.S. Congress looks every day more like a middle school lunchroom, that the people that Congress governs seem to follow suit. That we have lost the ability as a nation to even have civil conversations anymore. Everything just feels like a battle. It was Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, she's now known. She once said, "Today, if we have no peace, it's because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. That man, that woman, that child is my brother, my sister. That if everyone could see the image of God in their neighbor, do you think that we would still need tanks and generals?" As I discussed last week, it is people that are not like us that oftentimes allow us to grow the most. The problem, though, with Google filters and algorithms, with Facebook friends, with watching the news by narrowcasting instead of broadcasting, it means all too often that we surround ourselves with people that are just like us. People whose views, whose opinions, even whose prejudices are just like our own. Cass Sunstein of Harvard has shown that if we surround ourselves only with people with the same views as us, that we become only more entrenched and only more extreme. What we are lacking, what we so desperately need in this time, are connections. Encounters with people that are different than us, so that we can learn that we can still strongly disagree and still be friends, that we can still work together. It is in those connections, in those encounters, where we discover that those people that are not like us are people just like us. That whenever we reach out, whenever we make a connection with someone whose color or class or creed is different than our own, that in that moment we help repair the world. We heal some of those fractures that we find ourselves in. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks is a British rabbi, philosopher, theologian, author. And he suggests that the easiest way to look at an age, to get into that age, is to ask, what do they worship? Throughout history, everyone has worshiped many things. Some have worshiped the sun, some the stars. Some have worshiped many gods, some one God, some none. But I would ask you, as you look at our world today, what do we worship? Rabbi Sacks suggests that future anthropologists will look at the books that we read, the books on self-help, self-realization, self-esteem, that they will look at the way in which we look at morality as being true to oneself, that we will talk about politics as a matter of individual rights and liberties, and that they'll look at this new religious ritual that we have created. You know which one I'm talking about. Selfie. And what they will conclude is that in this time, that what we worship is the self, me, the I. And I think sadly he's right. That all too often that is true, that we are living in, as Amanda suggests in her book, a toxic culture of individualism. There is so much emphasis in our culture these days on personal freedoms, on self-interest, on self-expression, that the idea that life is an individual journey towards personal fulfillment. You do you, we say. Let me give you an example of this. This summer, as the coronavirus was spreading rapidly, spiraling out of control, the suggestion was no, regulations were passed that required us to wear masks as we go out in public. This was based on the recommendation of scientists and public health experts. But suddenly it became politicized. It was an affront to our personal freedoms and liberties. It was around that time that I came across a tweet. I don't remember who said it, but it simply said, "Hey, America, your selfishness is showing." Around that time, too, there was a piece by Paul Krugman in the New York Times calling out what he refers to as America's cult of selfishness, that believes that far too many of us have become enraged by any suggestion that our actions should take other people's welfare into account. You see, wearing a mask is not just something that we do to protect ourselves. It's one of the ways that we show care and concern for other people. One of the ways that we love our neighbor as we love ourselves. You see, sometimes we forget that we are biological creatures, that we are social animals, that we have spent most of our evolutionary history in groups with other people, that we need those interactions, those face-to-face interactions, because it's there where we learn, as Rabbi Sachs says, the choreography of altruism. It's in those connections that we create friendships, where we discover things like trust and loyalty, love. But when we have too much of the I or the me and not enough of the we, that we find ourselves vulnerable and fearful and alone. It was no accident that Sherry Turkle of MIT called her book on the effect of social media Alone Together. Rabbi Sachs says that the best way to safeguard, to strengthen the future of you, is to strengthen the future us. You see, as people of faith, we know that, don't we? That we have been called, we have been reminded that we are called to care for the little and the lost and the least, that we are to speak out for the people that are on the underside of power, that have been pushed to the margins. We are to speak out for those who have no voice, to offer those that have been downtrodden not just a hand out, but a help up. By this, Jesus says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you just love one another. Look, I know that loving each other is hard work, and that the drama and the pain of the world can sometimes feel overwhelmingly intense. But we become whole when we remember that we belong to each other, that we are all in this together, that my well-being is closely connected to your well-being and your well-being to mine, for better or worse. As Amanda says in her book, that we are called to show up with love every day and simply ask, what does love look like here, now, today? She goes on to say, I have come to believe that love is all about finding peace in the midst of chaos, finding connections in the midst of divisions, experiencing healing between the breaths of exhaustion and suffering, and working for ways of loving both personally and systemically in the midst of the overwhelming fear and anger and division that swirls all around us. See, when we move from politics of me to the politics of we, together we discover those beautiful counterintuitive truths that a nation becomes strong when it cares for the weak, that a nation becomes rich when it cares for the poor, that a nation becomes invulnerable when it cares for those that are most vulnerable. That is what makes a great nation. So for the sake of future you, let us strengthen us. For we belong to each other. Just as I have loved you, Jesus said, so you should also love one another. Because by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. Amen.